ladies and gentlemen. You know, one of the hardest things about this online entertainment stuff is the lack of eye contact with an audience, right? So I was thinking about that here, how we have a tendency to watch ourselves in the cameras without staring actually at the camera and making direct eye contact with the people we're talking to. It's interesting. Next time you're watching an online entertainment where somebody's entertaining you online, pay attention to that. And you'd be surprised how disturbing it can be to have a conversation or to have somebody talking to you without actually making direct contact with you. Anyway, welcome back. That's your words of wisdom from your old Uncle Scott at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. Super glad you guys are here. Looks like we've got some visitors from Uganda turning in. Love it. You guys, I'm super excited to hear from our next guest, Mr. Zach Foster. He is the executive director of the Mises-Mambi Institute of Cuba. He is, for 3 years, he's helped get vital resources and a voice to libertarians behind the Iron Curtain in Cuba and in Venezuela. He also does Hispanic outreach in the Libertarian Party here at home. So, Mr. Foster, Zach, are you with us today?
Hello, hello.
Yes, hello. Welcome to Taxation is Theft Fest 2020. Thank you for being here.
I'm incredibly glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look forward to hearing from what you have to say today. I will step back. These folks get tired of hearing me talk all day, right? So I'm going to step back. I'll give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you'd like to talk about, and then I'll keep an eye on questions in the chat. So if anything comes up, I'll let you know. But for now, the screen is yours.
Good deal. All right, so hello, everybody. Thank you to all of you who are watching. I'm Zach Foster, and as our wonderful host said, I'm the executive director of the Mises-Mambi Institute of Cuba. What is the Mises-Mambi Institute of Cuba? It is Cuba's Mises Institute. Just like we have a Ludwig von Mises Institute of Economics here in the United States, and we have Mises Institutes that are based in other countries, same thing's going on with the Cubans. They've had a small Mises group there for over 5 years now, and over time it developed to become an actual Mises Institute in and of itself, except Cuba's Mises Institute, which is partially run in Cuba and partially run here in the United States, is kind of a hybrid because we don't just do economic theory, we also do incubation of activism. We want to see libertarians going out there and we want to see them educating people in the streets about libertarian ideas, limited governments, free markets. These are obviously things that can be very controversial, if not dangerous, in Cuba. And we also want to see what kind of political action people can make out of the things that they're learning. Are they going out there and are they educating people? Are they getting the attention of the government? Are they preaching that free markets are an antidote to Cuba's economic ills that have been caused by the socialist dictatorship? Well, absolutely. So there has been a Mises group going on in Cuba for several years now, and it's now the Mises-Mambi Institute. We do come out with approximately 50 original articles and several other reports and other types of academic scholarship every year. We come out with videos on a pretty frequent basis. Some of them will be videos of activism and education and other libertarian shenanigans that are going on in Cuba or Venezuela, but with English subtitles so that our international English-speaking audiences can know what the hell is going on. And other times it will be English education, but subtitled in Spanish, not just for Cuban libertarians or Venezuelan libertarians, but for the entire Spanish-speaking audience of people who might be looking for libertarian ideas, or they might be doing research about whatever particular topic that we're talking about. Now, this is probably the most mild and the most academic as this talk is going to get, because a lot of this is going to be a roller coaster ride, and some of the information that I tell you might seem mundane, but other bits of information that I have for you guys today is going to be downright disturbing. So grab your drinks, buckle up. The roller coaster ride to hell is just starting. Best way to begin this story, the story of why I'm here telling you guys about all of this, I'm just going to tell you how I got involved in this. I'll call it a rabbit hole. It is absolutely a rabbit hole. And I got sucked into the rabbit hole in February of 2017. So, like I said, there is a Mises group inside of Cuba that has become the Mises-Mambi Institute since I got involved. But when I got involved, it was still just a small book club in Havana. And that's really what it was. 5, 6, 7 people meeting inside of a room, inside of somebody's house, with a couple of Spanish language copies of Theory of Money and Credit. I don't think they even had copies of Human Action. They had a couple of copies of different Murray Rothbard books that somebody from Spain sent them in Spanish. And that was it. They would study these limited ideas, and whenever they could, they would try to go out and find some internet connection so they could research these ideas on the internet and find out more about libertarianism. The growth of the libertarian movement inside of Cuba is definitely a very organic thing that happened of the Cubans, by the Cubans, and for the Cubans, and it just happened to be foreign libertarians like myself who helped out. But back in February of 2017, there were two libertarians, and I say that with a small L, two small L libertarians were arrested by state security in Cuba. State security is the secret police, the political police. If the FBI and the NSA was the same agency, that would be state security in Cuba. And state security was founded by none other than Che Guevara. A lot of leftists have turned him into a symbol of peace and a symbol of love, which is highly ironic because he was actually a lifetime guerrilla fighter who was quite literally dedicated to starting a world war between communist countries and capitalist countries. But after the Cuban Revolutionary War and after the Castro clique came to power, once the communists started consolidating control of the new revolutionary Cuban government, once the Soviet advisors came in, then they started rebuilding Cuban society along the same model as the Soviet Union. So they absolutely had to have a level of Orwellian police spying. And by the way, that does not mean that it doesn't happen here. That does not excuse the activities of the CIA or the NSA. But we're not talking about the NDAA. We're not talking about Homeland Security. We are talking about libertarianism behind the Iron Curtain in communist countries. So Che Guevara founded the state security agency, which locked up these two libertarians. The incident was they were approaching a house in Havana, which is now the location of the Benjamin Franklin Libertarian Library. They have a very modest little library. It looks very much like the one that's behind me, except the walls in that house are pink. And these two people were on their way to a book club meeting in that house when they got stopped by a couple of guys that were dressed in plain clothes. That's actually really common for Cuba because state security likes to go undercover all the time. Now, if you are a Cuban, it's pretty obvious who's a state security guy because really, like, only gangbangers and government agents will just sit there on a Vespa on a street corner watching the same couple of houses all day. There's really only two groups of people in the entire country that do that. And if you have nothing to steal, then it's probably the secret police. So that's what was happening that evening. They got approached by the secret police who demanded these two libertarians show them their ID. One of them, whose name is Ubaldo, he said, "Hey, you're in plain clothes. You have not identified yourself as a police officer. You can pound sand. I'm not showing you shit." So those guys came back later with their badges and also with the National Revolutionary Police, and they arrested these two libertarians. And at first, the trumped up charges were attempted assault of a police officer, but because there were some different witnesses, different neighbors hanging around seeing the event, they couldn't go with those trumped up charges. So the new charges that these guys actually got convicted on was distributing enemy propaganda. Now, don't quote me on this, but I'm almost sure that the books they got caught and arrested with was Spanish translation of Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty. That's what these guys got a criminal conviction for. That was the enemy propaganda. Why is that enemy propaganda? Was it attacking the Castro regime? No, but that book very clearly attacks statism and it attacks socialism. And one important thing is under Cuba's constitution, or the old constitution, because they redid it recently, Article 53 of the last Cuban constitution says that only socialists have freedom of speech, or freedom of speech only exists in keeping with socialist objectives. So what does that really mean? Freedom of speech only exists in what the Cuban Communist Party or the Cuban government decides is acceptable. Obviously, speech, any kind of speech criticizing socialism, or that could be misconstrued as disagreeing or criticizing the Cuban Revolution, it's just plain not allowed. So that's what these guys got criminally charged for, distributing enemy propaganda. One guy got sentenced to a year and a half in prison, and he served his prison sentence in full. The other guy got sentenced to 7 years in a labor prison. The guy who got a year and a half was Manuel Velasquez. The guy who got 7 years was Ubaldo Herrera. 3 years later and 3 months to the day, he is still in a labor prison in Cuba. The way that I got involved was shortly after these guys got arrested, other members of the Mises Cuba book club started showing up to come to the rescue. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering what the Mises Cuba book club has to do with Venezuela, everything goes back to Cuba. So I got to explain this. I'm just going to give you guys a little spoiler right now. The crisis in Venezuela is triggered in part by an ongoing invasion and military occupation by the Cuban government and the armed forces. Literally, everything goes back to Cuba. So the rest of the guys in the Mises Cuba book club started mobilizing after these two guys literally got sentenced to a gulag. They got sent to a labor prison for the high crime of having a Murray Rothbard book. One of them in Havana got on the phone and he called one of his friends who was a refugee who had just recently arrived in Miami. A lot of Cuban refugees to this day will brave 90 miles of shark-infested waters and choppy oceans to try to get to Miami because they believe it is worth it risking their lives just so that they can get over here where there's a higher standard of living, where there's not a Marxist government that squeezes out almost every form of entrepreneurship, where there's not anywhere near the insane level of political persecution that exists in Cuba. Again, I'm not saying that there is no political persecution inside this country, because if there wasn't, then Ross Ulbricht would not still be in prison today. But again, we're not talking about Ross Ulbricht. We're talking about libertarians behind the Iron Curtain. So a gentleman by the name of Nelson from Cuba called his friend, who was also a member of the Mises Cuba book club, but he had finally managed to get himself off the island. He had just arrived in Miami. He was living there as a refugee. His asylum had just barely gotten approved. He still did not speak English. So that guy got onto social media and he started crawling through all these Spanish language libertarian groups on Facebook, desperately searching for somebody, anybody, to pay him a little bit of attention and find out what's going on. At the time, it was early February of 2017. I happened to be posting in the Spanish language groups, and I was looking for some inspiration in the Latin American libertarians because I was personally disappointed not only with the lackluster performance by some of the top staff of the Gary Johnson presidential campaign, but also how so many people in the American libertarian movement who claim to be libertarians at the very last moment allowed themselves to buy into this propaganda of, oh crap, last minute, we got to vote for Donald Trump because Hillary Clinton is going to be communism. Well, I disagreed with that henny penny, the sky is falling attitude. And so I was incredibly disappointed with how many people did that. So I really didn't want to talk to American libertarians at the time. I was kind of cranky and feeling let down by American libertarians. So yeah, I felt like taking my ball and going home. And my version of that was saying, screw it, I'm going to talk to the Latin American libertarians. If there is any area of the world that has been absolutely ravaged over the last 50 years, it has been Latin America. That's where people are going to be appreciating libertarian ideas. I'm not going to hang out with you American socialists, So that's how this guy, this refugee, found me. And he messaged me. He blew up my inbox. Help me, my friends, blah, 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 libertarians, blah, 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 arrested by state security, blah, blah, blah. They're in a labor prison. And I'm going, what? What the hell is going on? So again, this guy was explaining to me, blah, blah, blah. My friends got arrested for having libertarian books. They're in a labor prison. Please help me get the word out. This guy was very adamant that we help him get the word out. He was specifically not asking for money. So that's how I eventually got confidence that this was not some kind of a Nigerian prince scam. And he never did ask for money. He really did want some exposure for these libertarians who got sent to the gulag for the high crime of having books critical of socialism. And it's not like in the Ethics of Liberty, Murray Rothbard was going out of his way to attack socialism or socialists. Just the fact that the book disagrees with those political and economic theories is bad enough. And also, with these guys in particular, Cuba does that North Korea thing where if your grandparents were, had bad politics or something like that, or if your great grandparents were landlords, or if your great grandfather was actually a South Korean soldier that got taken POW by the North Koreans and never got released back to South Korea, then for generations, all of those people's relatives would also be treated as second class citizens. So these guys were a victim of that. Their parents or grandparents did something stupid to piss off the local Communist Party person 60 years ago, and then generations later, state security is watching their kids and their grandkids. That is a reality of life inside of Cuba. So that's how I got involved. These people directly contacted me, came to me, showed me evidence that these libertarians were locked up, and they dropped this whole problem in my lap. And the way that I was raised, when people are in a crisis situation like that, an emergency situation like that, and somebody comes specifically asking you for help, I don't believe that you can just tell that person to pound sand. I firmly believe that you got a responsibility to do something about that. So that was that was the way I felt. I had a responsibility. So I asked one of my friends from the Libertarian Party of Nevada Executive Committee, uh, and my good friend Alexander De Benedetto, who's not in Nevada anymore, but he was part of the XCOM at the time, says, "Well, I really don't know what to do either, Zach, but I guess we could put out a proclamation, a resolution, something that we could send out to the media and to the wider world, communicating that what's happening here is wrong." And I said, "All right, fine, that works. Let's do something." So next thing you know, February of 2017, the Libertarian Party of Nevada was the first Libertarian Party to publish a resolution condemning the Cuban government's arrest of these two libertarians and also demanding that they be released immediately. And then next thing we know, the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire published a similar resolution a couple days later. Then the Libertarian Party of Oklahoma and New Mexico, the Chicago Municipal Libertarian Party. Next thing I know, there were over a dozen different state parties, and then it was being debated. That same resolution was being debated on the LNC. And then the LNC published a resolution a couple of months later saying the same thing, condemning the Cuban government's arrest of these libertarians and calling on their immediate release, and also proclaiming their support for the growing libertarian movement in Cuba. And this was something that was absolutely beautiful, because behind the Iron Curtain of Marxism Leninism, inside of this very Orwellian country, where it's not only required that you live under socialism, but if you're going to participate in society in any way, shape, or form, you have to play the game and publicly kiss Fidel Castro's ass. And the fact that there was a group of people who were specifically choosing not to do that, but also rejecting this, Miami right wingism that so many of the Cuban exiles are characterized as subscribing to. This was entirely different. These were people who were not of the left or of the right. They were specifically libertarian, and it was happening inside of a communist country. So, absolutely, American libertarians were getting excited about that. I mean, these are ideas that absolutely excite me. Hell, that's why I'm wearing this Rothbard T-shirt. And by the way, if you guys have not been to Rothbard's restaurant and ale house in Connecticut, you absolutely have to go check it out. My shout out to Joe Farrell. Much love to you, brother. Anyway, the more the international community started paying attention to the Cuban libertarian, even to the point where Libertarian Party of Spain was publishing resolutions about what was going on in Cuba, Libertarian Party of Russia, despite their problems and the war that the Putin government is waging against them, they still found time to decry what was happening in Cuba. So this was perhaps the first time that libertarians, capital L libertarians and small L libertarians around the world, consciously came together to try and do something to help our oppressed brothers. And that was, in my opinion, a new moment in the history, a watershed moment in the history of the global libertarian movement, because that showed such a huge paradigm shift from what we were 100 years ago, 130 years ago, Way back when, it was on one end of the world, just the Austrian School of Economics over there in Vienna. It wasn't that many people. And then at the same time, you had people like John Stuart Mill and some of the abolitionists over here. Maybe you had a couple of English Enlightenment era liberals, and that was about it. Nobody had ever made the word libertarian. And then that word came into the lexicon about 100 years ago. But even then, for decades, it was just people writing op-eds in obscure economic journals. It was Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard writing essays about how the other one sucks more. And next thing you know, the libertarian movement grows exponentially under Ron Paul. That was another watershed moment that many of us were privileged to witness about a decade ago. And then from the Ron Paul revolution to see that these ideas exploded to the point where there were independent Mises groups, not only in Cuba, but also in Latin America. Today, there is a thriving Mises Institute in Venezuela. There are others in Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Russia, other countries. It is absolutely insane. These libertarian ideas are taking off. And the more that the international community started paying attention to what was happening in Cuba, the more the Cuban regime started stepping up their level of repression. I remember one night the libertarians were all holed up in that house where the Ben Franklin Libertarian Library is, and they were calling us American libertarians, furiously blowing up our phones. They were absolutely terrified because the counter-terror police had surrounded the house, and they had cordoned off the streets, and whenever they would peek behind the closed curtains out the windows to see these police officers, they would see guys with combat helmets and bulletproof vests and boots and riot gear and rifles, the whole 9 yards. It was absolutely insane. And this is what libertarians are facing on a regular basis in communist countries. The only libertarians inside the United States I can think of who have ever faced military grade weapons are probably the ballsy people who got involved with the Bundy Ranch rebellions back in 2012 and 2014. Those are the only ones I can think of. Maybe somebody's ex-wife, got pissed off and said, "Hey, my ex-husband's got a bunch of guns on the property. He's dangerous." It's few and far between. Whereas in Cuba and also very much in Venezuela, libertarians are made, and other dissidents also, are made to stare down the barrel of the gun, while some military asshole or some police asshole or some civilian paramilitary asshole talks about all the different ways that they're going to die because they're right-wing fascists. So the more that they stepped up their level of oppression, they said, you know what, we have to step up our level of activism. So next thing you know, these small L libertarians, this Mises Cuba book club in Havana, they formed the Cuban Libertarian Party. The Cuban Libertarian Party was founded in May of 2017. And then next thing you know, another round of repressions. And a lot of people have told me in hindsight, a lot of people coming out of the woodworks today have told me, Zach, 3 years ago when they started the Cuban LP, I'm going to tell you, brother, we really thought that they were going to get annihilated. Like, we really thought that all of them were going to get arrested and made to disappear in the middle of the night. And that was going to be the end of the libertarian movement in Cuba. And I said, well, they sure as hell tried. I'm not going to lie. They sure as hell tried to annihilate the Cuban LP. There have been multiple times where members of the Cuban LP have been kidnapped by the police, as in usually the police can arrest you if A, they have a warrant, or B, they witness you committing some crime in which they intervene on the spot. In this case, though, the police will have followed somebody or scoped them out for a couple of hours and figured out when they're vulnerable. Then they just grab them. They'll grab them, drag them into a police car. Sometimes it's an unmarked car because every once in a while they do things that are off the books. They'll beat the shit out of the person while he's in the back of the car. Then they'll interrogate them, ask them, what have you been doing? Who have you been seeing? Then they hit them some more. Then they'll drop them in the outskirts of town. So we're talking about a 15, 20-mile walk. We're talking 30 kilometers here. We're talking an entire night full of walking. 12 to 14 hours from where they dropped you off after beating the hell out of you. And then they tell you often when they would drop these guys off, they would steal their shoes. First, they would let these guys have their shoes. But for example, one of the co-founders, both of the Mises-Mambi Institute and of the Cuban Libertarian Party, his name is Nelson Rodriguez Chartrand. Nelson had been kidnapped, beaten, and dropped on the outskirts of town at least 3 times that I counted in my involvement, and a lot of us on the international team, because there was myself, there was a couple of other American volunteers, then there was my assistant, Mamela Fiallo, who is Ecuadorian, and she lives down in Ecuador. She used to live in Buenos Aires. We also have Angie Chamorro from LP Spain. All of us are on the team of international volunteers, and we would be getting phone calls from Cuba in real time while people are saying, hey, the police picked up Alberto. Hey, the police picked up Herbert. Hey, the police picked up Caridad. Or they'll say, hey, Leonette got arrested on false charges. It was absolutely insane. So the Cuban regime absolutely tried to stomp that movement out of existence, but these libertarian activists were merciless. They were tireless. The president of the Cuban LP is a lady whose name is Caridad, which translates to charity, and that's a very appropriate name because this gal, in addition to her libertarian activism, she's also involved in different little informal social groups and NGOs. She's a longtime member of the Ladies in White, which is a special dissident society of former political prisoners or the wives and or mothers of former political prisoners. And Caridad has been both. The Ladies of White get the crap beat out of them by the cops all the time, even though they're specifically a Pacific organization. But she also will do things like mobilizing all the libertarians to go get a little bit of money and then get some ingredients together, and then they'll make little cakes and they'll take them down to the orphanage, and they'll just have a cake and ice cream day with the orphans. Every once in a while, we'll send them a grant so that they can do charity activities. Every once in a while, we'll send the Cuban libertarians a grant. We'll send them, $20, $30, and that enables them to have this big ass barbecue in the backyard where they have all the Libertarian Party members and then anybody else in the neighborhood who's curious and who's ballsy enough to be, photographed by state security going to this event where they can learn about new ideas. They do that. And Nelson, the co-founder, this guy went full James Bond. One thing that a lot of people don't know is freedom of movement inside of Cuba and also inside of Venezuela. It's taken very much for granted. You've got to have government permission to go outside of your own province. So Havana, yes, it's a city, but it's also its own province, like a federal district, and then there's a number of other provinces around the country. Nelson, repeatedly, without permission, would just buy himself a bus ticket and take a bus to another province. And he'd go meet up with an old activist buddy, or sometimes he'd really take a chance and he would meet up with another activist that he met on a group on Facebook. And that's one of the reasons why it took so long for cell phones and the internet to get to Cuba, because the regime knew once they give people some kind of internet access, even though they can block a crap load of pages, even though they can censor the internet as much as they can possibly hope, people are still going to find ways to connect. And that's exactly what happened. So Nelson connected with people from other provinces through Facebook. He connected with people from other provinces through personal contacts. And he illegally left Havana province to go grow the libertarian movement. Sometimes it would be founding new chapters of the Cuban LP, and other times he would just be doing the basic libertarian philosophy course through the Mises-Mambi Institute. And then other times he would just be visiting with friends, preaching the gospel of anarcho-capitalism. Nelson is an anarcho-capitalist, while other people in the Cuban LP are minarchists. And when I noticed that, that was another beautiful moment for me, because we went from just a couple of people in a house in Havana to all of a sudden we have anarcho-capitalist Cuban libertarians and minarchist Cuban libertarians. We went from a small group of people, who really didn't know what they were talking about, this libertarian stuff, to now there's pro-life and pro-choice libertarians. And that growing movement in Cuba is starting to echo the movement over here in the United States. That is absolutely beautiful, and that is the last thing that this Stalinist regime wanted. So I'm incredibly proud of the Cuban libertarians. Now, I've talked about those guys a lot longer than I planned to, but everything goes back to Cuba. That's how I got involved with them. And the more that we learned about politics in Cuba, and the more that we learned about the Castro government, the more that we learned what the Castro government was doing in the rest of the world. Oftentimes, American libertarians tend to get tunnel vision for the CIA and the U.S. government. Ron Paul Institute, not Dr. Paul himself, but Ron Paul Institute is absolutely guilty of getting CIA and US government tunnel vision. The more that I worked with the Cuban libertarians, I realized, that there are some really garbage governments out there in the world besides the U.S. government, absolutely tyrannical governments, if not in more ways than the U.S. government, then in different ways than the U.S. government. And that is one thing that helped take off my blinders as an American libertarian, because instead of having CIA or U.S. government Tourette syndrome or fixation on that, I learned that we are living in a Game of Thrones world where there are multiple corrupt, bloodthirsty kingdoms all trying to conquer each other and all trying to take advantage of their weaker neighbors. That is absolutely the case with the US government, with the Russian government. It's definitely the case with the Chinese government right now. And it is absolutely the case with the Cuban government. Everybody puts a lot of attention recently on the way the Chinese Communist Party has slowly been spreading its influence across the Pacific Rim, across the rest of the world, across the developing world. But a lot of people often overlook this little empire that the Cuban regime has been building for itself, and people tend to, kind of just look right past it. Nobody would expect a little island country, especially a poor island country like Cuba, to be this imperial power. But then again, look at the history of the British Empire. The British Isles are these small ass islands in the North Atlantic off the coast of Europe that during a couple of hundred years they pretty much controlled a quarter of the world, even though Britain itself, as islands are very poor in natural resources. I'm actually kind of surprised that those people ever got the hell off of those islands to go conquer out, an entire empire like they did. But if that island nation a couple of hundred years ago was able to do that, then why would the Cuban island nation or that regime not be able to do the same thing in the 20th and 21st centuries when we have all this technology? What are some examples of Cuba trying to grow its empire and even do military interventions? Well, I told you guys earlier that Cuba has invaded Venezuela. Very literally, what the United States government is to Afghanistan, Cuba is to Venezuela. There are thousands of Cuban soldiers in Venezuela right now. And most people don't know it because the Cuban regime learned from America's PR disasters in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They learned from America's PR disasters in Abu Ghraib, from the incidents involving the Blackwater troops killing civilians. They learned from all of that. They saw so many photographs in all these different newspapers and magazines, Time magazine, other magazines, of this U.S. soldier with an obviously American combat uniform, holding a rifle while some Iraqi girl gets searched, or while some Afghan farmer's cart gets searched. There's just no way to be in that photograph and not look bad and not look like an invader. So they don't wear Cuban uniforms in Venezuela. Every Cuban soldier in Venezuela wears the uniform of the Venezuelan armed forces or the Venezuelan police, or in the cases where Cuban advisors have been attached to the paramilitary forces, they just wear civilian clothes. There are thousands of Cubans inside of Venezuela, which is why the Maduro regime has lasted so much. So this is where we get to the main topic that was alluded to in the title: Libertarians in the Venezuela crisis. As I said a moment ago, the more we learned about what's happening in Cuba, the more we learned about what the Cuban government is doing abroad. And so we, the American libertarians, and also the international team that was helping out the Cuban libertarians, we contacted the libertarian movement of Venezuela, and we decided to offer our assistance to those guys because, number one, we saw that they needed it. Number two, we were interested in continuing to help out libertarians in communist countries. And number three, this was a beautiful way to kind of stick it to the nose of the Castro regime. So we're helping out the libertarians in this country that the regime has colonized on behalf of the Cuban libertarians. We started out on behalf of the Cuban libertarians, and the Venezuelans were incredibly happy to receive our help. The first groups that we started working with were Libertarian Movement of Venezuela, and a lot of that was consulting and fundraising. Consulting as in how to have an effective political movement, especially when you've got this small group of people not a whole lot of money, and then all the established political movements and political parties, they've got people who take it for granted that they're going to vote for these big parties, and these big parties have all kinds of money. Well, the problems that they go through are not very different from the problems that we American libertarians go through. So that was a lot of the. Oh, excuse me.
Whoa.
I done knocked the crap out of the tripod here, but there we go.
It
Restored
happens.
it. Hopefully everybody can see me. Sorry about that. Believe me, nobody
Yep.
has a bigger heart attack than me.
I
So at
bet.
first it was consulting. Then we moved a lot to helping them fundraise. For example, some of the folks in the Libertarian Party Mises caucus helped us out with a virtual fundraiser. The Venezuelans needed to raise a few $100s to be able to do a national recruiting tour. So Mises caucus raised something like $800, and that kept about a dozen people in a van on the road for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And they were able to go across Venezuela. Now, that would never happen in the United States because gas prices and food prices. But down there, where the U.S. dollar goes a long way, $800 got them 3 weeks on the road. And yes, they did absolutely recruit new people into the libertarian movement, into the Vente Venezuela political party, because the libertarian movement is not a political party. It's just the official libertarian club of Venezuela, whereas the libertarian-ish political party is called Vente, which means come Venezuela, and they wear blue shirts. And they also recruited some people into Mises Institute Venezuela, and they increased the size of their audience. Mises Institute Venezuela, very important people. They get a lot of the information about our philosophy and the economics out there. And every time that the Venezuelan government would do something stupid, like increase inflation of the bolivar by another 1,000% or so, or 10,000%, in order to be able to pay off the Maduro regime's debts to Cuba or debts to China or debts to Russia, then Mises Institute Venezuela was on the scene, and they were making videos about that, and they're educating people. And us in the Mises-Mambi Institute, every once in a while we've subtitled those videos so that our English-speaking audiences can appreciate what's going on there. So it's been really cool to get feedback on some of these Mises Venezuela video clips from libertarians in Scotland, libertarians in Australia, libertarians in Canada. All of a sudden, the reach is growing much larger, and these folks in Venezuela are on a lot more people's radar. That's not only good for libertarian solidarity, but it is also good for these people's safety, because the more international attention there are on these individuals, the harder it is for the regime to make them disappear. Because make no mistake, there is absolutely a war on libertarians in Venezuela, just like in Cuba, except in Venezuela, it is even more brutal. It is even more severe. Perhaps the most severe case that I can think of right off the top of my head happened to a Venezuelan libertarian by the name of Laurent Soleil. He had to flee from Venezuela because the regime accused him with false charges of terrorism. What it was, he was a student leader. He led some marches against the regime on campus, and apparently in Orwellian Venezuela, if you lead some peaceful marches to criticize the regime, then that is quite literally the equivalent of terrorism. So they started mobilizing the counter-terror police to look for this guy. So he got his ass out of Venezuela and he fled to Colombia. But there was a different administration that was governing Colombia at the time. And one of these things that the Cuban regime and the Venezuelan regime, and also to a certain extent the Chinese regime, like to do is they'll use international means to continue persecuting these people when they're outside of the country. So they were formally requesting that Colombia extradite Laurent Soleil, which they did, except they didn't extradite him formally. They never had any kind of arrest warrant. They didn't charge him with any kind of crimes or anything like that. Just because the Maduro regime was making a number of threats about military action on Colombia's border, and the last Colombian president felt like negotiating with them. The Colombian National Police arrested Laurent Soleil from his safe haven in Colombia, and they handed him over at the border to the Maduro regime. So this libertarian spent the next 4 years in an underground dungeon at the intelligence service headquarters. The acronym for the intelligence service in Venezuela, the Bolivarian Intelligence Service, is SEBIN, SEBIN, but it literally means the Bolivarian Intelligence Service Again, if the CIA and the NSA were one crappy organization rolled into one, that's where he was, and they have this underground prison at their national headquarters where they keep a lot of prisoners. And there's a number of Cubans down there also who are teaching the Venezuelans how to do interrogations, which is a euphemism for torture. I originally, when I heard about what was going on with Laurent, I thought that his experience would be similar to the Cuban libertarians with this very rustic looking rock wall prisons, Count of Monte Cristo looking type dungeons like they have in Cuba. And Laurent said, no, absolutely not. It was the opposite. It was like a hospital. It looked more like the Hunger Games. It looked like a clinic. And when they wanted to do something to you, they would, wheel you into a particular room, sometimes march you, sometimes drag you. And if they wanted you to talk, or if they wanted to hurt you, then they would find some kind of acidic chemical compound and they would inject it into your arm. And then next thing you know, your whole body's on fire for 20 minutes because you've got this burning agent that's doing nerve damage to you. Other times they would hit him with truth serum, which makes you a lot more loosened up and it makes it a lot more difficult not to reveal information. Other times they would put plastic bags over his head and then bring him near the point of suffocation where he's about to pass out. And then they would bring him back to and then like hit him on the head, box his ears. The number of tortures, the amount of tortures, and the variety that this libertarian endured are absolutely horrendous. And this happened not just to him, but to so many other people. As a matter of fact, not long before Laurent himself was freed from this jail, they actually murdered an opposition city councilman out of that same building. And they wrote it off as suicide. Now, this is a maximum security facility because, number one, it's like the National Intelligence headquarters. So not only is it have security as an intelligence headquarters, but there's a prison underneath. And then this guy fell from the fourth floor window, even though he was locked up in an underground prison. And the regime said to the public that it was suicide. So just think about that. In a maximum security facility, this guy escaped from the basement and then decided to climb up to the fourth floor and then jump out a window. I guess, to fight the power. So that's just some of the nonsense where, in a very Stalin-esque way, they'll just kill you and, blatantly lie to you about what happened. And that's the point. That's the whole message right there. Without revealing that card to the rest of the world, even though it's super transparent, without revealing their hand to the rest of the world, they're telling their own people, this is what we will do to you if you question authority. This is what we will do to you if you continue to lead marches and student groups against the Bolivarian Revolution. There's another libertarian that I want to tell you guys about. Her name is Melanie Manjoud, and her ordeal with the National Guard and with the communist paramilitaries happened a little bit over a year ago. So everybody remembers when Juan Guaido became the president of Venezuela. Which, by the way, let me just make a quick note. There is a misconception that's going around the international press that Juan Guaido declared himself president. That is absolutely a falsehood. That came from the Cuban propaganda machine, and other media outlets picked up that line. He did not declare himself anything. He actually didn't even want to show up for his first day of work as president, but the National Assembly elected him as president. Now, according to Article 233 of Venezuela's constitution, which is Hugo Chavez's constitution, if there is no duly elected president, then the National Assembly will elect from their own body. It's like the House of Representatives, except they only have one House of Parliament instead of two. Then they themselves will elect somebody from the National Assembly to be the provisional president, and then his job basically is running the government and also making elections happen so that they can have a regular president instead of a provisional one. So he was elected under the Constitution as provisional president. And instead of helping to topple this regime or making elections happen, unfortunately, Juan Guaido has only worked on securing his personal fortune and the fortunes of some of his allies. But fact of the matter is, he did not declare himself as a president. He is the legitimate president. Once he was elected president, declared president by the National Assembly, there was this big PR event. I don't know if you guys remember seeing the news last year, but Richard Branson was having that big old fundraiser for that Live Aid concert in Colombia that was right by the border. And then after the Live Aid concert, there was going to be these big old convoys of humanitarian aid that were going to ride from Colombia across the border into Venezuela. And the Venezuelan military was going to choose to throw down their weapons and not cut food and medicine off from their people who are starving and who are suffering from medieval level illnesses. There are literally people who are dying in Venezuela right now of the plague. That is some medieval shit. And that's what happens under socialism. This is what we see, if you want a Misesian reference, Pictures of the Socialistic Future by Eugen Richter, which is a fictional diary of somebody whose country becomes, it becomes a socialist country. And next thing you know, it becomes full on communist with a destroyed economy and mass poverty. What else? Anthem by Ayn Rand. This is after the revolution, and they're in this like Stone Age society where something as an electric light is treated as heretical. Well, that's the kind of thing that does happen. The final chapters of Atlas Shrugged, where you've got freaking covered wagons replacing the American railroad. That is what happens in these countries where the socialists and the communists take power. And that is literally what happened in Venezuela. So anyway, Guaido's president. Richard Branson has that big old Live Aid concert. They're going to bring humanitarian aid across the border. Surprise, surprise, the regime mobilized the army and the paramilitary on the borders, but also throughout the country to squash the protests because a lot of people supported Juan Guaido. That doesn't mean that they liked Juan Guaido as a guy. That meant that an overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan people were so sick and tired of that communist dictator Maduro, who had turned their country into a very poor satellite of Cuba, whose economy and whose oil had been ransacked by Cuba. I mean, we talk very openly about what America's motive was for invading Iraq. It was very obviously controlling shares of those oil markets. Well, guess what Venezuela's biggest freaking export is? I guarantee you the reason why there are thousands of Cuban troops and thousands of Cuban doctors that don't have any medical training whatsoever inside of that country is because of the oil. So anyway, this young lady, Melanie Manjud, she has a little foundation that she runs in Venezuela where she'll raise funds from outside the country. And then she'll occasionally do these weekend trips to the Colombian border. She'll cross into Colombia and get like a big fat pallet of different kinds of medication. And she'll bring them to these underserved hospitals. And she brings them to the pediatric ward. So kids with cancer, kids who need insulin injections on a regular basis, but they don't have them, so they got hospitalized. Kids with terminal illnesses, kids with non-terminal illnesses that are lethal if they're not treated, and so a lot of these kids are dying because they have untreated illnesses. This young lady, Melanie, she helps them. She goes and gets medicines for them. So it was February. It was that same weekend as when they sent the paramilitaries to go block and burn the humanitarian aid convoys at the border. Melanie had brought a shipment of humanitarian aid to one of the local hospitals. And inside of the hospital, while she was handing out medicine to kids, the freaking National Guard showed up along with civilian paramilitaries. Now, can you imagine? Because a lot of people have seen the National Guard in their in their neighborhood. People survived the Los Angeles riots. People survived Hurricane Katrina. A few people went to those National Guard field hospitals for the COVID. So people have seen the National Guard mobilize. But can you just imagine if you were not doing anything that was technically illegal, and then the National Guard just busted into the room along with civilian vigilantes? Like there's just some Joe Schmo in civilian clothes with a shotgun, standing right next to the soldiers. That's what happened to this young lady. And that's one thing that happens on a regular basis in Venezuela, where members of the regime with actual uniforms and government powers will often be flanked by their civilian auxiliaries, these random civilians who have weapons, and they're the only civilians in the country who have weapons because the regime made it that way. They'll just come and arrest you and drag you out. A lot of times, armed civilians will drag you to the police station instead of actual police officers. This is what happened to Melanie. She got dragged out of the room to another end of the hospital where first it was a National Guard officer that was interrogating her. Then the civilian paramilitaries slapped her around a little bit, and they were threatening her, yo, bitch, we're gonna fucking kill you if you keep doing this, blah blah. You're a traitor. You shouldn't be trying to undermine this regime. This is a revolution of the people. People like you deserve to die. You're evil for what you do. Now, mind you, they are actively stopping her from bringing medication to a pediatric ward in a hospital, but she is evil because she's going against their communist revolution. So this is the level of psychosis that's going on there. And she ended up getting arrested for like the day. She was detained for the day. And the reason that she was arrested is because the director of that hospital, who was put there by the regime as a political appointment, the director of that hospital, that Marxist, reported her to the National Guard. She called the police, and the police deployed the National Guard. Military response for the high crime of giving freaking medicine to sick children in the hospital. This is the level of control because they should have gone through the regime. The regime doesn't freaking have medicine to give to their own people, let alone to ordinary people who have no value to the regime. So she got arrested. She got slapped around. She got threatened with death. And the communist who runs that hospital, who reported her to the regime, that same person ended up becoming a victim of her own success. That hospital director at a later date got sick and she died because there were not enough medicines in the area to treat her. So, like, literally, this is a death cult. It is absolutely a death cult. This is what libertarians in Cuba and Venezuela are fighting against. Let me tell you guys about Jesus Noria, who is a member of the Libertarian Movement of Venezuela. On the 30th of April, when Juan Guaido led that fake military uprising against the regime, and we can get into that at another time, but it wasn't a real effort. It was only to free his ally, Leopoldo Lopez. But the fact of the matter is, the entire country went out into the streets to support this guy because they thought they were finally going to get rid of the regime. Well, Jesus, who is a member of the Libertarian movement, was wearing his Libertarian T-shirt. He was wearing his T-shirt with the big old porcupine on it when he jumped on top of a car, and he said, "Come on, people, let's march right up to the cops and let's tell them to throw down their guns because this is happening. We're getting rid of this regime." Well, the paramilitaries saw him. The civilian paramilitaries saw him. They grabbed him. They dragged him over to the National Guard where he was detained, and he got the shit beat out of him. He physically, literally got beaten. I saw the photographs of when they finally released him immediately after. He had a big old black eye around his right eye, and he lost 50% of the vision in his right eye. Let me tell you guys about another libertarian. His name is Franklin Camargo. He was a medical student at Romulo Gallegos University. He was training to be a doctor. And after Juan Guaido was sworn in as president by the National Assembly, all the students in the school were called into a big lecture hall where they got subjected to a communist indoctrination session about how everybody at this school owes the Bolivarian Revolution because they're getting free college. Look what the revolution is doing for you. You owe it to the revolution to support the president and not to support these fascists, blah, blah, blah. This is a socialist country. And Franklin literally just raised his hand and he said, "Sir, I disagree with this." And the guy said, "What? What do you mean? What do you mean you disagree with this?" And he says, "Yeah, I disagree with socialism. I disagree with the Bolivarian Revolution. I disagree with what you're preaching. I believe in free markets. I believe in free expression. And I think it's really inappropriate that that class time got interrupted for a political lecture." And that guy said, "Get out of here right now. Go to the dean's office right now." So he marches on down to the dean's office where that guy was waiting for him. Long story short, he got expelled. He got expelled for acts of aggression against the teacher. Literally, disagreeing. That's all he did. He raised his hand and very politely disagreed. And that was an act of aggression. And the words act of aggression quickly got spun into physical attack because during the days after his expulsion, Franklin started doing speeches, not only on his old campus, but also in other public places. And these speeches got the attention of the regime to the point where Diosdado Cabello, who is the number 2 guy in the regime, heard about this. And the guy has a weekly talk show. It's actually kind of funny if it wasn't so horrible. The Venezuelan regime has had this weekly talk show since Hugo Chavez started doing it almost 20 years ago. where they just talk about, whatever's going on that week. And it's supposed to be like the political version of Jimmy Fallon, except with, yay communism. And so Diosdado's on TV talking about, all right, so we've got this little fascist who's committing acts of aggression over here at this medical school. Sounds like a little punk. Well, if he's going to be committing acts of aggression and doing terrorism, then we can show him. So all you guys in the intelligence service that are over there in the state of Aragua, come on, what are you guys waiting for? What are you guys waiting for? Well, can you just imagine if the director of the FBI was on live TV talking to the FBI in that area about you? That's what happened to Franklin. So lo and behold, they started going after him, and he had to get the hell out of Venezuela. And he didn't really have a way to do that because he was just a young college kid. His resources were so stretched thin. So the person who took charge of getting Franklin out of Venezuela was none other than Dr. Kyle Varner, who is an American medical doctor and also a member of the Libertarian Party over here. Dr. Kyle Varner was personally involved in getting Franklin out of that country. And within 1 week of Franklin being inside the United States, he was attending his first meeting of the Libertarian Party of Miami-Dade. And nowadays, his asylum is approved. He lives in the state of Utah with his brother, and he is currently working as a medical interpreter. And once he gets all of his papers straightened out, he wants to go back to medical school because he knows that he was destined to be a doctor. And unfortunately, communism ruined his life. There's one last thing that I want to talk about. A lot of people have asked me why I am involved in Venezuela. Well, as I said earlier, originally I was involved with Cuba. And the more we learned about the Castro regime's war on libertarians in Cuba, the more we learned about the Castro regime's literal war in Venezuela, which unfortunately has evolved into a civil war because now we've got the regime is not only killing dissidents, but you also have Colombian guerrillas that are inside the country fighting with Colombian paramilitaries. So the Colombian Civil War spilled over into Venezuela, but Maduro invited the communist guerrillas into the country because they'll fight for him, and they do fight for him, and they're also part of his drug cartel. But now you have criminal drug cartels and criminal gangs inside the country who, other than the regime's people, the criminals are the only other ones that have guns. The criminals used to kind of work for the regime in the sense that the regime's like, all right, if you only rob and loot and murder the correct people, not our people, then you're good to go. Well, these people used to stick to that formula, but now they're openly fighting the regime. There's an ongoing war with the regime against this gangster in a particular city who's named Alexis, that he's got his own personality cult. The situation is so bad that people around the country are praying for this Al Capone-style gangster because he is less bad than the Stalinist regime that's over them. And people ask me, why am I involved? Because people asked me for help. First, the Cubans asked me for help, and then we offered our help to the Venezuelans. But the Venezuelans, they needed it. They were happy for it. And it got to the point where originally we were just giving them advice on libertarian activism. 3 years later, Kyle Varner has treated Venezuelan refugees at the Colombian border. He went down to the Colombian border and actually got involved. Recently, there was a failed military operation that happened with that involved some American mercenaries and some Venezuelan exiles. Well, over a year ago, I personally recruited several companies of American military contractors. That was my former career. I worked as a private contractor before I became a libertarian anarchist, but because I still had those contacts from my old life, and I'll wrap this up, I still had those contacts from my old life. I recruited people who were willing to pitch Juan Guaido's government on a contract like, all right, we will train your people, we can train the army. If you guys want, we'll also bring more columns of humanitarian aid into Venezuela. We can set up field hospitals to help out the civilians because they need food, they need medicine. And what we could help you guys do is establish, little islands of freedom inside the country while the army that we train fights. So we were not talking anything about a Bay of Pigs style CIA intervention. Our effort had nothing to do with the CIA. We were actually trying to help the Venezuelans liberate Venezuela. Unfortunately, Juan Guaido's government turned down our offers And we were wondering why back then, but we know today Juan Guaido's government doesn't want to overthrow the regime. Why? Because Juan Guaido is not right wing. He is a socialist. Almost all of the political parties in Venezuela are socialist and members of the Socialist International. That's not right wing, except Juan Guaido is not a Stalinist. So that's what Venezuela is. It's mostly the socialists versus the Stalinists, and the socialists are corrupt, and a lot of them have businesses that they started with these different communists 20 years ago, so they don't want the regime to end. They are actually very happy with the status quo while so many libertarians die. While the Venezuelan libertarians are saying, you know what? If our country is ever going to be free, and if our country is ever going to be not a nightmare, then we have to start over from the beginning with free markets, the right to bear arms, and an absolutely limited government. And we cannot do this alone. We need help. So I stay involved in the struggle for Venezuela's freedom as an individual. America should not have to fight Venezuela's war. But if there are Americans who are either vets who want to go down there and fight, or if there are American libertarians who want to help the Venezuelan libertarians continue to do their thing, then absolutely, as individuals, we should answer the call for help because they are asking for it. And that is not for an intervention, which is something that we libertarians are against. That is free association by voluntary individuals, voluntary association by individuals. Now, if anybody wants more information on Cuban and Venezuelan libertarians, the website is www.cubanlibertarians.org. That's cubanlibertarians.org.
Awesome, Zach. Thank you so much. We went way over our time today, but you were very insightful. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining Taxation is Thus Fest 2020. And
the pleasure. My voice is hoarse.
Yeah. So and we'll give a big shout out to Dr. Kyle Varner. He's a good friend of mine. So
good
anyway,
deal.
All right. Take care. Thanks for being on, and we'll see you next time.
May the force be with you.
And also with you.